What would you do if you picked up a cat that could poop as an adult on a rainy day? What hilarious stories will happen when this man and cat get along? Let's step into the story of Hora, Mimi George Mieteru. Enjoy a love story between a man and a cat together. George is a cartoonist. He likes to be alone. One stormy night, he picked up a cat on the side of the road and returned. What he didn't expect was for the cat to turn out to be a boy. A frightened George was going to call the police, but who would say no to a cute tomboy with ears? So he silently put down his cell phone. What surprised him even more was that the cat could talk. He said his name was Evan and he was a cat. He had a brother, but now they're lost. George asked Evan to recall any familiar buildings. After he draws it, he can't find it for himself. Evan paints a familiar landscape. George brought it in for a look. This familiar place is really familiar everywhere. By the time he tried to ask more detailed questions, Evan's attention went to the painting George had drawn. He praised him for his good drawings, but before he could finish his sentence, he sneezed again. George had to tell him to take a shower first or he'd catch a cold. With that, he pushed him into the restroom and asked if he could take a shower. The result was that not 5 seconds later, Eva's shriek came from inside. It turned out that the water was too hot. George helps him to adjust the water temperature, but Evan gets the wrong shampoo and body wash again. Worried that something might happen to him, George had to wash him himself. After washing, Evan began to get sleepy. Watching him, George's whole being was attacked. He forced himself to calm down and took Evan to the bedroom to let him sleep on the bed, planning to sleep on the couch himself. But Evan pulled him back with one hand. He said the bed was big enough for 2 people. Faced with the lovely Evan, George, who couldn't say no, said yes right away. But the sleeping Evan kept leaning toward George. He had no choice but to take a pillow and quilt and sleep on the couch. When he wakes up in the middle of the night, Evan, who has turned into a cat, is sleeping on his stomach. When he woke up the next day, George took Evan's picture and made him a cat finder, which he posted around the neighborhood. He then went to the pet store to buy the food Evan eats, but he didn't know what to buy. The owner enthusiastically gave him some recommendations. The owner also let him buy a litter box and gave him some more toys. After realizing the cat was found, the owner said he would post a claim for him on Facebook. What neither knew was that someone was behind them listening to their conversation. George comes home with his stuff just in time to see Evan coming out of the restroom. He knew that it shouldn't need a litter box. After seeing him eat the bread, he knew cat food wasn't needed either. But when he pulls out the cat teaser, he finds Evan intrigued, so he started teasing him. That's when the call came. It was his good friend Myra stopping by to see him. She can't be seen with Evan, so George hides Evan in his room. George told him to stay inside.
Meow, อยู่ในห้องนี้นะ
Myra brought Kuitio and the 2 of them ate it together. She told George that the editor-in-chief thought the style of his comics was too bland. That's probably because he's so lonely on his own. If he doesn't get a girlfriend, how about a little pet? Over here the 2 are eating. Unexpectedly, Evan opened the door to his room and walked to the restroom. George could only break Myra's face. After dodging a bullet, he ran to the restroom. He told Evan to stay inside and not to go out. Turns out Myra said she had to go to the restroom. George couldn't stop it. After opening the door, he realized that Evan wasn't in there. It was a huge relief for him to see the light in his room. After Myra left, George worked until 5 in the evening. He didn't stop working until Evan got hungry. He was going to get him food, but there's nothing in the fridge but a couple bottles of water. So he had to go out and buy it. Evan was clamoring for it too, and pouting at him, but the ears were a problem. Evan took them back, but the next second, his tail showed again. This retracts the tail and the ears come back out, but he still wanted to get out so badly. Evan's pampering is truly irresistible. George could only find a hat for him to wear. It was covered, but my ears hurt a little from the hat. George told him to hold back. When we got to the grocery store, George let him pick what he wanted and went grocery shopping on his own. He remembered when he was alone, when he saw others eating hot pot. He wanted to eat with Evan, but Evan's ears were getting sore. George stroked his hat soothingly. This scene was seen by the girls on the side. Evan was hit and his hat fell off. To block his ears, George shoved Evan's entire head inside his jacket. The girls next to them saw them like this and happily snapped pictures. George could only buy a random bento and go home. Evan looked at the fish in George's spoon and couldn't take his eyes off it. George could only put the meat in his bowl. In exchange, Evan trades his vegetables to George as well. It's just that George doesn't like vegetables either. George has to work late today. Evan also intends to accompany him. He was teasing himself on the side. George is drawing with crayons. In the end, he just couldn't hold out any longer. He fell asleep against George's leg. George carried him to bed and watched him sleep adorably. There was also no word on a Facebook posting from the pet store owner looking for the cat. This left George helpless. George was woken up by Evan early in the morning. They found the house in disarray and the drawings he had saved were missing. because Evan wants to catch a fly that's disturbing George's sleep. He accidentally knocked over his glass of water. Water splashed on the plug and something went wrong with the computer. So instead, he was able to negotiate with Myra to turn in his manuscript at night. Evan pours George a glass of water, which is disliked by George. He told him to take it somewhere else. After a busy day, George finally turned in his comic. George saw the paper towels thrown in the trash and realized he was trying to catch flies. He got wipes for Evan's hands and apologized to him. Although Evan was asleep and didn't hear it, the refrigerator was empty again, and George had to go food shopping on his own. He ran into the pet store owner. He told George that having a pet is a hard thing to do. If he can afford to keep it, he can't put it in a pet store. Although since having Evan, life has started to get busy. He was even meaner to him today, but comparatively, he also had a lot more fun. So George isn't planning on not raising Evan. He bought the ingredients to make fondue and went home. The two men were happy to eat. Because he's been so busy lately, George hasn't had time to go out shopping. So for the past few days, the two have been eating noodles with canned fish. But Evan didn't mind and had a good time eating. George has been putting the cat hunt out for a long time. But strangely, Evan confirms that his brother is nearby. But until now, there has been no word from him. And it's not like Evan can't find his brother. Yet he wasn't afraid because George was really nice to him. Not only does he have a place to sleep, he has something to eat. George felt relieved to hear him. Having someone with you now fills your life with the unknown. George actually doesn't want Evan to leave. Evan got food on his mouth and he licked it off himself. When George got food on his mouth as well, Evan actually pushed George down and licked it as well. The time came for George to turn in his manuscript, but he was uninspired. That's when Myra's call came. Duh, and he had to gloss over it. Myra gave George a surprise. A seminar organized by the company featured George's idol, Professor Huang. However, there is a limit to the number of spots available for the event, and it requires sending artwork to each other. Myra decided to send George's almost finished work. She asked him to send her the last drawing at noon the next day. George, who got the message, tried to paint properly, but he still had no inspiration. And Evan is boring. If they get out and about, maybe they can draw. So George plans to buy Evan clothes. Once the two arrived at the mall and bought their clothes, George decided to buy Evan a hat. This way, Evan doesn't have to have an earring every time he wears a ducktail. But they tried a lot of things that didn't feed. Finally, the two saw a woolen hat with ears. Evan's ears don't hurt at all when he puts them on. The hats are limited edition and you have to buy both together. Evan wants George to wear it with him, but George doesn't like hats. Back at home, George thought about hurrying up and catching up on his work. He gave Evan his dinner and told him to fill his plate and eat it. Go take a shower by yourself and start painting right away. Evan looked at George, who was working seriously. To give him a better environment, he opened the window to let the breeze in. He then turned the desk lamp on for more light. By herself, she ate her dinner in peace and drew with crayons. And George, feeling the breeze, was inspired as if it were a spring, and finished the draft without a hitch. After the drawing, he saw Evan fall asleep on the table. Seeing his drawings, George wrote above his own miniatures. Very funny indeed. George sent the draft to Myra. As a result, he was told by Myra that the style was different. Luckily, it was just that she was just asking off the top of her head. Myra wonders who George went on a date with to draw such a sweet storyline. To celebrate the successful delivery of the manuscript, George decided to have a big dinner with Evan. Evan wants to eat lots and lots of fish, but all we have at home is canned fish. So George decided to go to the market to buy it together. Evan showed a lot of excitement for his first ride, but he arrogantly said no. Seeing George stand up, unknown to him, he also stood up. After realizing that George was just giving up his seat, he arrogantly said he was doing it to keep George company. The car arrived at the station and Evan, who had pulled the armrest, jumped on top of George. Evan didn't feel anything, but George frowsy. He didn't come back to his senses until Evan reminded him that everyone was getting off. The market is huge. George is afraid to let Evan out of his sight for fear he'll get lost. But Evan says he's not a kid anymore. As it turned out, George turned his head and the man was gone. Turns out Evan heard the bell and ran after the popsicle seller's uncle. Seeing this, George can only say that his brother likes bells. He also bought two popsicles. Evans accidentally dropped it on the floor. Seeing that he was still trying to pick it up and eat it, George stopped him just in time. He gave Evan his popsicle. The two of them bought a lot of groceries. When we get to the fish pond, George asks for pomegranate fish. The boss was helping him look for it. When Evan saw the man passing by, they were carrying what appeared to be the pomegranate fish that George had asked for. So he gave chase. After the owner finds the fish, George realizes Evan is missing. He was anxious to find him in the market. On the other hand, Evan catches up with the man and realizes that he's not carrying a pomegranate fish, but a carrot. Looking back, he realized he couldn't find George. Panic was growing inside him. That's when he heard a bell ring. He followed the sound to the outside of the market and saw George with the bell. He cried and jumped into George's arms to apologize to him. After that, he was never afraid to leave George. He kept tugging on George's coat and leaning close to him. It was the first time George had ever felt wanted. He was an orphan and the kids didn't like him. George, who knows how to help Aunt Nora with her chores, Auntie will also teach him to cook. And Auntie told him that there would definitely be someone who would like him in the future. She tells George to take the dishes. She taught him and make them for the people he loves. Evan and George came home from the market to buy groceries. So George was going to make that one fish fondue that Aunt Nora had taught him to make for Evan.
เขาเป็นคนบอกให้พี่ทำเมนูให้คนที่รักกินนะ
คนที่รักเหรอ
After reacting to what he had said, George could only say it was made for people who like fish. Simple Evan was also fooled. Seeing Evan trying to help, George gives him the knife to help cut the vegetables. Who knew that he had only just stepped away when Evan cut his finger? George helped him put a band-aid on it. Even though his finger still hurt, Evan wanted to help. George wouldn't dare let him touch the knife again. So he asked Evan to do the dishes. Evan, who felt he could help, happily took it to the wash. On the other hand, forgetting the order in which the dish was made, George had to call Aunt Nora and ask her. After Auntie told him the steps, she asked him if he made it for his girlfriend. George tried to say he wanted it too. George hung up the phone with his aunt. Just as he was happily cooking, Evan came out of the bathroom. He also brought in all the suds and unwashed veggies. He also thought that washing vegetables was the same as bathing with soap. Just as the two were talking, the fish in the pan burned. So, the two of them had to eat instant noodles with canned fish again. Evan felt useless. George has been the one taking care of himself, and he can do anything to help. But George didn't blame him. Instead, it's Evan's presence that makes his life interesting. George finally got dinner ready, and it turned out Evan was already asleep on his back. He could only helplessly wake him for noodles. At that moment there was a knock on the door. As soon as George opened the door, the other man barged right in and hugged Evan. Looking at the two brothers, who were excitedly recognizing each other in front of him, George frowns outright. He was overwhelmed by the suddenness of the situation. Evan's brother tells George that they are the Earthers. The others were able to tuck their ears away, and Evan because something happened to him when he was a kid. So, he can only put his ears away now when he's around the person he feels warmest towards. Jesse was going to bring him home the next day. The thought of Evan leaving him soon bothered George, so much so that while playing blocks with Evan, he accidentally snapped at him again. He drove Evan to bed. He knew he couldn't let go of Evan. He thought about how Evan had changed since he picked him up that day. He went from being alone to having someone in his house waiting for him to come home. But there's no place to vent this annoyance. So, all he could do was tell Evan to pack his things and prepare for Jesse to pick him up. The next day, George finished breakfast and got ready for work. That's when Myra called. She asked George to come to her house to discuss the job. So George let Evan pack at home by himself. Instead, he went to Myra's house. After work, Myra played with her pet dog for a while. She told George that the dog was running out of time. Even though she now has to travel back and forth between her hometown and Bangkok every day, she still has to spend more time with her dog. George figured it out all at once. Even if it's only a day away, he's going to have a good time with Evan. So he borrows Myra's car to take Evan to the beach. Who knew the car would break down in the middle of the day? After they dropped the car off at the repair shop, they hitched a ride with an older man. The older man looks mean and has tattoos all over his body, but he's actually quite nice. He dropped the two off near the beach. Afterward, the two walked to the beach. Who knew it would suddenly rain? All they could do was find shelter from the rain. Evan brought blocks to play with. George felt that the whole day had gone badly and couldn't give Evan a good memory. But Evan thought it was a good day.
แต่เหมียวว่าวันนี้ก็สนุกดีอ่ะ
That's when the rain finally stopped. The two ran to the beach, but cat instincts scare Evan. George takes Evan by the hand and leads him into the water and plays in the sand with him. On the other hand, Jesse is playing soccer with his friends. That's when the underclassmen came over and mocked their jerseys. So, the four were ready to fight again. As a result, the two Jessies have been disadvantaged. That's when a friend twisted his foot, and the boys playing on the other court came over. He heard the schoolboys laughing at Jesse's jersey earlier for wearing the same jersey as Jesse himself. Therefore, he was irritated at the provocations of his schoolmates, so he took his friend's place. With him on board, Team Jesse managed to buck the trend. After the game, Jesse came to thank the boys. Then he went to his English class. Who knew we changed teachers today? The new teacher turns out to be the boy he played ball with, Mr. Henry. After class, Jesse apologized to Henry. He wasn't very polite to him because he didn't know he was a teacher before, but Henry didn't mind. And a second ago, Henry rejected the girl who wanted to add him to his social media app. In this moment, he actually took the initiative to add Jesse and agreed to play together next time. George saw the others taking pictures and was ready to take a picture with Evan as well. George asked Evan why the older man looked mean, but Evan knew he was good. Evan explains because he couldn't smell it, but George wasn't so convinced. He asked Evan to smell what he was feeling right now, and just then, Jesse called, so he was ready to take Evan home. They're going to have a fish fondue before sending him back, and Jesse caught up with the meal. George, who watched Evan feed Jesse his food, became even more despondent. After dinner, George gave Evan's things to Jesse. He told them to hurry home or the roads would be unsafe. George just watched the two leave. At this point, he was alone in the house again. George flips through pictures of the two of them together, looking at the hat he didn't get to wear, and is left alone with his sadness. At that moment, Evan, who had forgotten to return George's door card, returned. George turned his back on him and instructed him not to get lost again. Otherwise, it won't be himself who picks him up again. Evan looked at George's back. He confirmed what he'd been smelling all day about George, which was sadness, so he was going to stay and live with George. Although his reasoning was for the fish fondue, Jesse agreed with Evan, because Evan never looks at anyone wrong. He thought about the two of them together as children. He's still a little forlorn now that the little heel around him is gone, but without Evan, he can't enjoy life and play as he pleases. That's when he got the message from Henry. Henry asked him to play ball with him tomorrow, and he happily agreed. George cut his hair because of his job. Evan thought George's long hair was his tail. Evan even cried sadly after seeing him cut his tail off. A frightened Evan turns into a cat. George received word that the seminar application from Prof. Huang was approved, but he's going to have to ask for more pieces to give to the other side. So, he's going to have to catch up on his work again. Halfway through the drawing, George fell asleep in front of the computer. His body couldn't take the continuous, intense work. Evan wants to make his bed so George can get some rest, but time was running out and he had to go on painting. At this point, the hand-painted board also protested and simply died. He was going to go out and fix it. Evan looks at an uncomfortable George and volunteers to go himself. George navigated him, put his hat on and told him to be safe. Then Evan went out with confidence. On the way, he resisted the temptation to eat, but his cell phone was bumped and the navigation was accidentally turned off. Luckily, he remembered that he had traveled this road with George before. George, who was waiting at home, had a nightmare. He dreamed that Evan was being bullied and had his ear discovered. Waking up with a start, he realizes that Evan has been gone for a long time and hasn't returned. He wanted to go out and find him, but his body couldn't pull itself together. Luckily, Evan opened the door and came in at that moment. He helped George sit down. George asked him why he'd been gone so long. Evan told him what happened on the road. Then he pulled out the repaired hand-painted board. He also bought porridge for George on the way. George felt better and got ready to mop the floor, but he was still weak. Evan used his forehead to take George's temperature. That one made George's face even redder. He helped George to lie down on the couch and offered to mop the floor. Then he lay down next to George to sleep with him. Myra comes into the sight of the two of them cuddling. She also saw Evan's ears. George thought she'd be scared, but what he didn't expect was for Myra to pounce on Evan all at once. She excitedly went to touch Evan's ear. Afterward, George told Myra the ins and outs. Myra promised to help them keep their secret. Myra came this time to tell George that the list of workshops is out. She asked George to confirm for himself that he passed. All three were happy to have George's name on the list, but the seminar is in Bangkok and he has to go to Bangkok for a week. Thinking that there was no way for Evan to go, he decided to pass up this chance to meet his idol. Myra looks at him like this and decides to be accommodating and let him take his family. So George and Evan immediately left Myra behind and packed their bags. The two took a bus to Bangkok and Evan was excited. He thinks about going to a lot of places to play. As a result, George was hit before he even left the bus station. Evan realized something was wrong and ran after the man. George then reacted to the fact that his wallet had been stolen. Evan managed to pounce on the thief. He hit him hard with his cat's paw and recovered his wallet. He also sent the thief to the police station. There wasn't much money in the wallet, and George thought with horror about what would happen if something happened to Evan. But Evan didn't go after it because of the money either. He pulls out the picture of George in his wallet. George then realizes that Evan is chasing the thief for his picture. It was a relief to George to watch him commiserate. Still, he instructed him not to take any chances next time. The two arrived at the hotel where they had been booked, but the room went from a double to a king. At night, George is embarrassed and doesn't know what to do. I can't watch TV, and I can't sleep well. He also plans to sleep on the floor. Evan can't sleep because he recognizes the bed, so he runs to the floor to sleep with George as well. George is thankful to Evan for helping him recover his last photo from his long hair days. The old George had no one to share it with because he had been alone, so he doesn't take pictures very often unless his job requires it. But since then he's had Evan, he's had someone to share it with. George decided to take more pictures with Evan to make these memories, but Evan had fallen asleep beside him. Myra takes her coffee and reads the contract. By accident, She was hit by a girl. Coffee spilled on the contract. After being introduced by her co-workers, she realized that this was her new assistant, named Polly. Myra felt a little hard to look at the girl, who was getting herself into trouble as soon as she showed up. On this day, Polly takes the list of seminars to Myra. When she went to the set, she also accidentally bumped into a piece of foam board and almost fell down. Luckily, Myra held her up and blocked the foam board. Myra asked her to speak to discuss the meeting rules to Prof. 1, but Polly accidentally deleted the file. She wants to help make a new one, but Myra says it's faster to do it herself. Polly felt bad. I can't do anything to help and I'm giving her a hard time. But it wasn't the last time she made a mistake. On this day, Myra asked her to make copies of the documents. As a result, she accidentally put the document on top of the papers to be shredded. The other party didn't look at it closely enough before putting it in the shredder and the document was churned up. Myra was chagrined by this. Polly is afraid that Myra doesn't have a file to archive, so she takes the churned up files and spells them out. Myra didn't see her doing it until she was off duty, although she had someone else resend the file. But she stayed to help Polly put the rest of the papers together. On the other hand, Jessie and Henry have a basketball date. However, it was Henry who was picking up the ball for Jessie the entire time. He also asked Jessie to go to the dorm to watch the game. Knowing he was coming, Jessie was excited to clean the house and turn himself inside out. Henry looked at Jessie, who had come to pick him up, and thought he was dressed strangely. The two were going up the stairs when the elevator unexpectedly broke down. They had a hard time climbing up the stairs, but just then, Henry gets a call that he has to leave in a hurry. Jessie was a little lost, even though he said it was okay to come back another time, because Henry has always looked like he doesn't really want to talk to people. He thought he had upset him, so when he next met Henry, he took it upon himself to ask him about it. Henry then explained to him, because of a nerve injury to his brain when he was a child, he is less able to express emotions. He doesn't have many friends because of that either. Jessie hears this and rushes to reassure him that he now has himself as a friend. They also made plans together to watch the game again on Saturday. On Saturday day, Henry brought wine over to watch the game again. He even complimented Jessie on his cuteness when he saw a picture of him with Evan. He pulled out a beer, and Jessie had wanted to try watching the game while drinking a beer for a long time, so he drank the whole bottle of beer. Henry looked dumbfounded, but Jessie, who said it wouldn't get drunk, fell asleep in a small second. He didn't wake up until the game was over. Seeing that the game was lost again, Jessie showed his ears in chagrin. He excitedly explains to Henry, but Henry was a little surprised, but couldn't tell at all because he couldn't express his emotions. He also stated to Jessie that he wouldn't tell. Jessie blushes just thinking about it. Because he was distracted, he accidentally hurt his finger while playing with Henry. The English teacher said Henry was moving dorms. Jessie then realized that Henry was supposed to move to a new dorm today, but the landlord gave the house to someone else, and today he'll have to live in a day room. So Jessie decides to invite Henry to be his roommate. This way, he can also tutor himself in English. So it's a win-win situation. Henry thinks it's feasible, but he makes one condition. Jessie's grades will have to improve if he tutors him. Otherwise, he'll move out immediately. Later that night, Henry felt overwhelmed and slept on the couch. There is a thunderstorm in the middle of the night, and Jessie, who is afraid of thunder, shows up directly in front of Henry. He turned into a cute cat, so Henry slept with the cat for the night. To his surprise, Jessie regained his person the next morning. For a moment, both of them were embarrassed as hell. Evan and George came to the hotel restaurant for dinner. They were recognized by the Rannis brothers. George isn't sure what his feelings for Evan really are. He just felt that it was uncomfortable to be recognized as a brother inside. While riding in the elevator, Evan saw that there was a lakeside restaurant. George looks at him fascinated by the food and decides to take him out to dinner after work. The venue for the seminar, Holly was the first to arrive to check out the work. She also brought her own computer because she was afraid of using the company's computer and deleting files by mistake like last time. Myra taught him her homepage and told her that these things just need to be done skillfully. She herself can't do it quickly because she used to do it all the time in school. Holly subconsciously said I know. It made Myra very curious as to what she really knew. Luckily, the guests arrived at that point, so Myra didn't ask any further questions. After arranging the guests, Myra asked Polly to pick up George from the hotel. George set everything up for Evan and left in peace. When he went downstairs, he saw someone who resembled a star. After he left, Polly arrived. She also asked George if the man from earlier was Ken. George, who hasn't seen the TV show, certainly doesn't know who that is, but he knows that now, because Polly was excited to give him the scoop on Ken. The two then took a cab to the seminar, but the driver took the wrong road and they were almost late. George saw his idol at the workshop. He was excited in the same way Polly was when she saw Ken. When it was late at the end of the day, seminar and George rushed back to have dinner with Evan. Instead, he ended up seeing Evan sleeping on the couch in the hall. Turns out Evan was playing alone during the day. When he heard a knock on the door, he thought it was George coming back, so he came out and opened the door. As a result, he saw that the knock was not on the door of his room. Disappointed, he didn't notice the door behind him. By the time he reacted, the door had closed. He didn't have his keys, he didn't have his cell phone, and he didn't know who to call, so he had to sleep on the couch in the hall. George listened and knew he must be hungry, and was going to take him to the lakeside restaurant for dinner. However, they were told by the staff that the restaurant would be closing soon. However, the hotel's restaurant is also available a la carte. He ordered his meal at the restaurant and took it to the lakeside dining room. A hungry Evan wolfed it down after a long day. George made a promise with him that he would come to the lakeside restaurant for dinner tomorrow. The two were eating when voices spoke from outside. They could only hurry. At that moment, a voice called Evan from behind him, and the man who called out to Evan turned out to be Ken, whom George had just met that morning. It turns out that Evan and Ken knew each other when they were kids, and Ken is also an earther. He also volunteered to put off work, intending to help take care of Evan while George went to the seminar. George gets a little jealous watching Evan act close to Ken. The next morning, George and Evan were getting ready to go to breakfast. Then George went to the seminar and Evan went to play with Ken. To George's surprise, Ken arrives early in the morning to pick Evan up for dessert. Evan hesitates, but George lets Ken take Evan anyway. Though after they left, George instantly felt harder on himself. Even he was a little distracted listening to his idol's seminar. After receiving their photos, George was even more jealous. During the seminar, Prof. Huang asked everyone to draw a picture with the theme of attachment and then show them one by one. Turns out Polly's computer got stuck and it projected a lot of pictures of Myra. In the end, it was Myra again who solved the problem. After the seminar, the company prepared dinner. Prof. Huang also invited George to eat with him, but thinking about his appointment with Evan, he put off dinner with his idol. Prof. Huang thought it was a pity, because George was very pleased with the words he drew with the title of Ties, and George's ties Evan. Polly knows she made a mistake and plans to apologize to Myra when it's over. But Myra was more interested in knowing why she had so many pictures of herself. Under Myra's duress, Polly had to spill the beans. Turns out she's a Myra fan and has been secretly following Myra for a long time. Even she came here to work so she could get up close and personal with Myra. Myra didn't think it would be for this reason, but her heart was still happy. Polly knows that she can't be Myra's assistant anymore, but Myra gave her a chance anyway. As long as she doesn't make another mistake, she can't stay. On the other hand, Evan, who came out with Ken, was happy but kept thinking about George in his mind. When the two returned to their room, Evan waited for George. He was sure that George would keep his promise to come back and have dinner with himself, but Ken told him that the seminar is usually followed by dinner. That's when George called. Evan and Ken both thought that he was coming to say that he couldn't have dinner with him, but just then George opened the door and came in. Ken is surprised that he's back at this hour, and Evan was happy. He was going to take a shower and then go to dinner. George though thanked Ken for taking care of Evan all day, but he's urging Ken on in all his words, trying to get him to hurry up and leave. Ken gets right to the point and asks George how he feels about Evan. George hasn't figured it out yet. He thought he had the same love for Evan that he had for his brother. Ken, however, tells him that one does not develop such emotions as jealousy towards one's brother. George thought about how he had felt when his aunt had spoken that day. He also felt that Evan was different for him. As long as it suited Evan, he felt happy no matter what he did. These emotions of his are just likable to Ken. Ken is also relieved to leave his brother in George's hands. He also chartered the lakeside restaurant for the two so they could enjoy their dinner. Yet faced with a table full of goodies, Evan only wants the CRPS and tuna George made for him. In addition to bagging the restaurant for the two of them, Ken gave George the hospitality vouchers for the spa hotel. So George takes Evan to the hotel to soak in the hot springs. Ken tells him that the hot springs here can't be soaked with clothes on. But after arriving, George realizes he's been duped by him. Evan also simply tried to get closer to George, but luckily George stopped him in time. Otherwise he wasn't sure what he would have done. But before George could reach the limit of his patience, Evan passed out from soaking too long. George accidentally fed him sick when he was feeding him water. This caused Evan to lose control straight away. He was gnawing at George, then Evan becomes the prototype. A night of chaos passed. The next day, the hotel bellhop told the two that there was a flea market nearby. They also get to watch fireworks at night, so they went to the market to play various games, even though it was Evan who wanted to play. The whole time it was George doing the work and Evan watching. Finally, the two made it to Goldfish Beach. George finally managed to fish one after breaking two paper bowls. Evan saw the envious eyes of the two children beside him and offered to let them have the goldfish. The vendor thought Evan was a good boy and gave him an extra strip. He also told the two men about a great place to watch the fireworks. The beauty of fireworks is fleeting. George is trying to hold Evan's hand. He's afraid that one day Evan will disappear. Like a firework, it lit up the sky, but only for a moment, and then the sky returned to darkness. But by then, I'm afraid I couldn't bear to live without Evan. His fear was mellowed by Evan. He thought George was afraid of the dark, so he offered to take George's hand. Like a calm lake brushed by a gentle breeze, George's heart was warmed by the presence of Evan. George, who used to not take pictures because he didn't know who to share them with. Since having Evan, he has begun documenting their life together. On the other hand, Jesse has been failing English. He made an appointment with Henry that if he failed this test again, Henry would have to move out. So, this night Jesse was going to read all night. Henry was with him, though, tutoring him all night on his homework. But in the end, Jesse turns into a cat and falls asleep. He woke up the next day and tiptoed around getting his stuff together for the test. He left a note with a thank you for Henry. The grades came back that day and Jesse still flunked. He's worried about Henry moving out over this, but Henry gave him another chance. He extended it until the next exam. Meanwhile, Jesse gets a letter that they're moving to a new dorm. Polly is late for work because of traffic and is seen by Myra. A coworker tells her not to tell Myra that home is far away for such a reason to be late. Myra was not late for work, even though she had to travel from her out-of-town home to work every day because the family dog was sick. So Polly wasn't late for anything after that. She also wanted to play with Myra's dog. Although Myra agrees, she gets a call from her mom saying the dog is in the hospital. She wanted to finish her work before she went, but Polly rushed her along. She also offered to help her drive so she could work from her car. George and Evan are organizing their clothes at home. That's when Jesse came knocking on the door. George wanted to serve him hot tea with cake, but there was no tea in the house. Jesse immediately said he could pick it up at his house. George and the guys then realized that Jesse had moved into the room across the hall. He also gets to know Henry and learns that Henry knows that Jesse and Evan are Earthers. Evan volunteered George to take them shopping. On the way back, George gets a call from Myra. That's when he realized Myra's dog had died, so the four rush to the vet hospital. Our human world is full of all sorts of things, but the whole world of pets is their owners. On a side note, you may not have pets, but please don't abandon them or hurt them. When she got back from the hospital, Myra bought a lot of food. She told everyone she was going to have a party to celebrate the dog's journey. For a moment, Polly thought she'd lost her mind with her grief, but Myra is really just scared that people are worried about her, which is why she acts like she's happy. She doesn't let people see her sad, so the six men drank to celebrate. Myra said that had never seen Polly without her hat. Junior Silver explains that she just likes wearing hats. Evan smelled something hidden in her hat, so he went right ahead and took her hat off, but he didn't see much. Myra moved to fix her hair. Who knew that when Polly got shy, a pair of ears suddenly appeared on her head? That's when they realized that Polly is also a rat in the Ear clan. In times of shock or excitement, her ears come out, just in case. That's why she kept her hat on. Henry is worried that the cats will fight if they stay with the mice, but Jesse tells him that they've evolved and it won't happen. As a result of turning his head, the not fully evolved Evan tried to bite down on Polly's ear. Luckily, George stopped it in time. After the celebration, everyone went to bed. Myra can't sleep and is alone on the balcony blowing off steam. That's when George came out too. Myra is thankful that George and everyone else was there for her on this day to keep her from being so sad. Myra says that life is like that and one day everyone will be separated. This is something George understands, but ever since he'd realized his feelings, he'd struggled with whether or not to let Evan know. Myra also quickly guesses that the person who made George unable to part is Evan. She urges George to figure out what he wants. He should hurry up and do what he wants to do and not make himself regret in the future.
ชีวิตคนเรามันสั้นนะเว้ยทำอะไรอ่ะก็รีบทำเถอะ
Jesse and Henry are organizing their things when Evan finds a picture of himself and Jesse as children. He also wants to see George as a child. George perfunctorily had to look it up himself, but actually George has been hiding pictures of him as a child. He's just never taken them out. Evan sees that he has found the photo and looks at it with George. As a child, George was lonely because he had no friends. He didn't know who he could smile at, so the photos show George with a very serious expression. Evan then told him that he could laugh with himself later. George wondered if it was someone else who didn't want to be with him, but then he realized that it was his own fear of being around people. But Evan's presence opens his heart. George looked at Evan apprehensively. He wondered if Evan would want to be with himself forever. Evan agreed to George's words after some thought. It's possible that Evan, at this point, didn't understand what George meant, but George is still happy. At least Evan can't stay with himself until he's really grown up. They can create a lot of great memories. On this day, Myra took 1,000 comics for George to sign. After George signs off, Myra asks him what he's going to do for Christmas. George then remembered that it would be Christmas in a month. He wants to go on a date with Evan with a couple hats. He still has to figure out what to buy Evan as a gift. Meanwhile, he vaguely remembers having to prepare a gift for someone, but not for Christmas. Myra was not happy when she heard that. She stated that if she didn't remember, it meant that person didn't matter at all. With that said, she let Polly organize her things and withdraw. That got George very confused. He can only ask Evan, as in a sigh, what he wants these days. But Evan either wants fish fondue or Santa Claus. The first one is not suitable as a gift. The latter is suitable as a gift. He had no choice but to find another way. On the other hand, since the last time Jesse made a pact with Henry, after the next exam decides whether Henry stays or goes, Jesse takes it very seriously. The grades are out and he's still afraid to look at them. Encouraged by Henry, Jesse plucked up the courage to open the page. He hugged Henry excitedly when he saw the 61 points, both frowsy at the same time. Jesse awkwardly lets go of Henry. Henry borrowed his computer to look up recipes. He also had to prepare the ingredients because the foreign language teacher was going to make lunch together on Christmas Day. Jesse volunteered to take him to the neighborhood to get it. He came across the street and tried to ask Evan to go with him. That just saved George, because he was going to go to the mall to see what kind of gift to buy Evan. He was worried that he didn't know what to do with Evan when Jesse came just in time to take Evan. So, he took Evan to change his clothes at night. While putting his hat on, he notices that Evan's hat is torn, so he let him take his out the door. Now he knew what to buy Evan as a gift. He immediately went to the mall and bought the gift. He couldn't help but wonder how Evan would react to seeing the gift. Just then, however, he saw Evan looking at clothes with Jesse not far away. At this point, it was too late for him to hide. Evan came up behind him. George could only excuse himself to go find Myra and leave nervously. Evan follows Jesse and Henry home. Henry makes his hometown tomato soup and serves a little for Jesse to try. Just as Jesse is about to say he likes it, Evan pops out and interrupts the two. Jesse could only turn around and say he liked tomato soup. He asks Henry about Christmas customs back home. He was thoughtful when he heard the accidental remark that Christmas was a time for family to get together. George took Evan to church. Evan is curious about everything he sees. George was going to take him on a date. Upon arriving at the mall, he saw many couples holding hands and George jumped at the chance. Who knew Evan had held him first? At George's surprised look, Evan however says that everyone is holding hands so they don't get lost, so he's going to hold hands too. George could only sigh helplessly. The mall is hosting a Christmas event. When Evan hears that the prize is a trip to China for a fish hot pot, he drags George straight to join him. The pair regretted finishing second. First place goes to the kindly older man who had helped the two men. His son has always wanted to travel abroad. He was also happy to win this time. Evan listened and felt no regrets about losing. And there's a prize for second place. Their reward was 2 outfits and 2 movie tickets. So, they got 2 movie tickets and came to the theater to watch the movie. Couples are everywhere on a day like this, and naturally so in the movie theater. Seeing all the other couples in love, George wants to take Evan's hand too, but he didn't make it. When he sees the movie villain kissing on the cheek, Evan asks George why they do it. All George can say is that when people feel happy, they kiss on the cheek. Jesse looks up the customs of Christmas in Henry's hometown and learns that they focus on the element of the star. They also have to be with someone they like, so he asked Henry out. At the end of the shift, Polly says she has a stomach ache and takes time off to get medicine. Myra got a call out of the blue that the customer wanted to change the product to a different program. She knew everyone had appointments on this day, so she didn't leave everyone behind. She was going to change it all by herself. But then, she sees that Polly is also at the company, and she stays behind to work overtime with her. After coming out of the movie theater, George is ready to give Evan the gift he bought. But just then, he got a call from Jesse. It turns out that Jesse has prepared a Christmas party for Henry to make him less homesick. But Jesse saw the look on Henry's face and thought he didn't like it. But he was just too happy to react for a moment. For Henry, it was the best gift he ever received in his life. Jesse was very happy to see Henry happy. For Jesse, he's already received his gift. Though, that gift was Henry. As long as Henry was beside himself, that was the best gift he could have. George finally gave Evan his gift, but Evan's reaction wasn't as happy as he thought it would be. Then, from behind him, he also pulls out a gift for George. It turns out Evan bought the same hat for George. Once again, but to have a couple's hat. At this point Evan felt happy, so he kissed George on the cheek. Once again George felt helpless. But what can George do when he's in love with a cat who doesn't know anything? He can only spoil it. At the company, the two worked hard to catch up and finally got the new program done. Myra takes a look at her cell phone and gets very nervous. She was afraid of delaying Polly's gift delivery, but Polly holds out the gift and delivers it to her. Polly stated that the gift was for her. Myra saw that the card said Happy Birthday, not Merry Christmas. Curious, she asked Polly if she had written it wrong. It turns out that George said earlier that he couldn't remember who he was going to give the gift to, and Myra was very angry, so she thought it was strange. Polly thinks that today is more important than Christmas for Myra, so she sneaks a peek at Myra's it and learns that it's her birthday. That's why she took time off work to go out and buy the gift. Myra was impressed, but then she got another call to wait for to send over the paperwork. This night she would have to spend at the office, and Polly decides to stay with her. Myra thinks Polly works hard and conscientiously, but in Polly's opinion, she hasn't worked half as hard as Myra. That day, she saw Myra and George going to the clinic together to sell magazines. Watching her work hard, Polly found what she really wanted to learn.
ขอบคุณนะคะที่ทำให้หนูรู้ว่า
On the other hand, Evan was sleepy and fell asleep after the four of them came back from the party, so George carried him home. Jessie saw that Evan's ears never retracted. As a child, when Evan was a cat, he was bullied by a human and hurt his ear. From then on, he couldn't get his ears back. Jessie thought Evan had spent so much time with George that he could start trusting humans, but now it seems that he still doesn't want to trust humans. It's New Year's right after Christmas, and Nora came to ask George if he was going back for the new year, but George could never let go of the thought of being a child. As a child, George was quiet and liked to draw in peace and quiet by himself, but also for this reason, many couples who came to adopt a child did not take him. Finally, one day, a couple was willing to adopt him. He happily packed his clothes and brought along the family portrait he had drawn. He wanted to give it to his mom and dad, whom he had met for the first time, but instead heard the sad news that they could not adopt him. It's hard to have hope and then have it dashed. Immediately afterward, he was scratched on the hand by a kitten. The successive blows left George's young mind indelibly damaged. All Evan could do was hold him and comfort him. Myra comes over to George's house, sees them eating, and has no problem bringing utensils to eat with them. George entrusts her to tell Aunt Nora that she won't be returning to the orphanage herself this year. Myra thought he hadn't let go of what happened in the first place. George, however, wisecracks that he's long since let go and just can't be sad about it anymore. When she heard him say that, Myra called Aunt Nora directly. George thought she'd do what she said. As it turns out, Myra actually says she'll visit her at the orphanage tomorrow. She knew that George had been through something terrible there, but Aunt Nora is getting older, and he'll visit her more while he can so he won't regret it later. And she would accompany him. Evan also took George's hand and said he wanted to come alone. Harry is going back home for New Year's. Jessie smiled though and said goodbye. But when Harry left, he was alone in his room, watching the game alone, lying in bed alone. Everything becomes boring. But he didn't expect to see Henry sitting on the couch when he woke up the next day. Turns out Henry's hometown was hit by a snowstorm and all flights were cancelled, so they had to wait until the water festival to go back. Jessie was happy to hear that the two could spend New Year's together. He did a lot of cooking and it was all fish, because he thought Evan would spend New Year's Eve with him this year. He prepared Evan's favorite fish, knowing that he misses Evan. Henry offers to go to Evan to spend New Year's Eve with him. Jessie thought Henry didn't like crowds and that's why he never said anything, but he didn't want to see Jessie upset any more than that, so he decides to take Jessie to Evan. On the other hand, the three Georges returned to the orphanage. They walked all over the orphanage, the places where George was alone. Arriving outside Aunt Nora's room, George finally mustered the courage to walk in. They greeted Aunt Nora and were put to work. Evan stays with Aunt Nora and folds the laundry. Go back in time many years, when Evan and Jessie were little kids. Jessie is having Evan practice closing his ears, but because Evan is always bullied by humans, he doesn't want to be around them, so he turned into a cat and ran out. As a result, he was again caught and bullied by a group of small children. It was almost dark and he hadn't found his way home yet. At that moment, Aunt Nora passed by, seeing Evan in his human form lying on the side of the road. She brings her washed clothes and puts them on Evan. She tells Evan that the owner of the dress is nice and Evan can't just wear it away. Then Evan smelled the odor on the clothes that belonged to the owner, and Nora was going to take him home when Evan happened to hear Jessie screaming, so he went back as a cat. After that, Evan started trying to trust humans. That's when Evan recognizes Nora as well. Nora is the one who dressed herself as a child. Evan thanked her. Nora, however, says there's another one, and she asks Evan if he remembers. At this point, Jessie and Harry, who have just arrived at the orphanage, are taken by Myra to look after the children. The two of them looked at a group of lively and cute little children, and they just couldn't do anything about it. Jessie sees the ball off to the side and summons everyone to play with it. He's on to separate teams from Henry, but because of Henry's expressionless face, the kids are afraid of him and don't dare to pass the ball over. It wasn't until Henry threw in a goal that the kids started to like the older brother, and he flashed a smile. George came to a tree after doing the laundry. This is where his grief began the most. He had been full of hope that he could have a new family, a new kinship, But these are broken by the cruel reality. He ran out alone. He saw a couple of kids bullying a small animal. He had tried to comfort the kitten after chasing them away, but it scratched the back of his head. The disappointment he had just felt, combined with the sadness of this one being scratched by a kitten, it was too much for him to bear, so he hid in a tree and cried. Since then, the quiet George has become more withdrawn. He eats alone, reads alone, and doesn't play with the kids. After leaving the orphanage, he lived even more alone, and the other person Nora was talking about was the owner of that dress. Evan smelled the clothes and knew they were George's, and the kitten that scratches George is Evan, who turns into a cat. So he ran to George and apologized to him. Similar encounters, familiar experiences. It turns out that when they were children, their destiny had already begun. That's when George's knots were finally untied. That's when Evan's hat fell off, his ears disappeared, and his tail didn't come out. Evan's childhood wounds are healing. Although his ears only disappeared for a moment, it was a big improvement.
เดี๋ยวมันก็หายไปใหม่แหละ
5 people decided to go watch a meteor shower. They were ready to go when a police car approached them. Surprisingly, it said someone called the police for Myra, and the person who got out of the car turned out to be Polly. Turns out Polly heard about it from a coworker. After Myra went to her friend's orphanage, she searched for all of them, and she did this just to ask her if she had passed her probationary period. Although Polly's performance has been a bit poor over the past 4 months, but for trying so hard, Myra let her through, because attitude is more important than ability. So Myra gave her a pass. Afterward, she takes Polly to the beach with her. A few people played until nightfall, still barbecuing on the beach. The moment the meteor shower fell, everyone made their wishes, and I wish all of them all the happiness and joy to be with their favorite people forever. Well, this is where the show really ends. It turns out that companionship really can mend a person's inner wounds. I hope everyone can find that person who can warm their heart. That's it for today's video. Thanks for your support and viewing. We'll see you in the next installment.